So we're now recording. So if we could begin the interview with your name, date of birth, place of birth, and your current status, please.
Okay. My full name is Dorothy Gillian Thompson. Colleagues in Paris in 1968 might have called me Dorothy. Colleagues in French history since have called me Gillian. Surname Thompson, born February 1943 in Duncan in British Columbia, which is a little bit north of Victoria, where I now live mostly. But I was for many years a professor of history, mainly French history at University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, there in 1972 to 2005, and I'm now professor emeritus. Previously, I might say I did have an appointment in 68 to 70 at Purdue University in Lafayette, Indiana, but I am a Canadian. And aside from that year and a year at Stanford as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow and a year at University of Illinois while I was finishing off my own PhD dissertation, I have lived either in Canada or the 2 years in France that I think we're going to talk about.
Yes, we are. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, your upbringing, what sort of education you had?
Sure. Public school education and then University of British Columbia. My parents were English. They'd immigrated with their parents as children, both to the same small agricultural community on Vancouver Island, Duncan, Cowichan Valley. And they would have voted CCF, although I think you could say they'd come out of the English liberal tradition. But my mother was very much moved by the bombing of Hiroshima and blamed the West for having done that, taken war to another dimension. So I grew up in an aura of kind of an international outlook and commitment to peace activism, but also social activism. So when I got the chance in school, and certainly at university, I studied social movements and social activism. I was very entranced by the study of the revolutionary movement in France, and as an undergraduate did a graduation essay on the Paris Commune of 1871. So when in pursuit of the PhD dissertation or research for it, when I went to France in 1966, I was already pretty committed to the left, but in non-ideological, non-doctrinaire terms. I had been active in the peace movement at UBC, but had also left it because of the change in emphasis from a kind of open-minded form of demonstration and open writing of letters and so on. I think that Marxists and on the west coast of Canada, Trotskyites as well, were very much involved they were very interested in having greater influence in the movement. And I left at that time. I decided my studies were more important than trying to fight ideological battles, and I've never been ideological. However, I've always remained in the same political position. I don't think I've evolved much at all. So at the moment, I have supported the NDP in Canada, which is, of course, mildly socialist, and I was very pleased by the election of the Liberal government, which is very modern and has a lot of young people in the cabinet. So that's my Canadian perspective.
Okay, can you explain to us what brought you to France in 1968, please?
Sure. Well, it was dissertation research. I had been a year at Stanford, but I was doing the dissertation and finishing the PhD for UBC under John Boscher, and the arrangements made were that I got a good fellowship, but I was to spend most of my time in France. So I had the 2 years from September 1966 to July 1968 there. And I was working primarily at the Bibliothèque Nationale and at the Archives Nationales, and also in some private archives. And I'd made contact with the Jesuit archives by then, but wouldn't work there until later in my career. So I was in France. I guess while I was there, I was also very interested to pursue the connection with the revolutionary movements of the 19th century I'd once studied. So in 1967, and I think this in some ways was the high point of my 2 years there. in 67, at the end of May, I attended the Commemoration of the Commune of Paris, 1871. I believe that was the last time it ever occurred because they weren't able to hold it in 68. And I think after that, even the Communist Party decided to move on. But I had 3 hours of watching the demonstration, witnessing the demonstration. And of course, it was a peace or protest and peace activist kind of event, because the main chant on that occasion, in the rain, surrounded by a few other onlookers and all the top brass of the Communist Party, is young people from the red belt around Paris coming by chanting "US assassin, US assassin." So that was kind of the ethos. Of course, by the following year, there was another event, which was by April, we had the assassination of Martin Luther King in early April. And that kind of marked the beginning of for me, the major events of that spring. But by then I was also very determined to finish the dissertation research, if I could, by July.
And during your time prior to the events, so from 66 up until 1968, what was your impression of life in France? Did you feel as though something was coming, or?
Very good question, because I can't remember exactly when, but of course I was at the Sorbonne from time to time. In 66, 67, I had attended a seminar there with Robert Montreux, but in the 67, 68, I wasn't. But I was at the Sorbonne occasionally meeting people and sometimes having coffee. Yes, I thought there was by the beginning of that year, there was a tone among students. There was a kind of enthusiasm I hadn't noticed in the first year. And of course, by the time the weather got better in 1968, everyone, everywhere was reading Mao Zedong's Little Red Book. I can certainly remember seeing that, much in evidence. Now, you might correct me about how soon that started. I would associate it, however, with the early months of 67. At some point, I should tell you about my own movements in the spring of 68, though.
Yeah, we will get to that.
Because I wasn't always in Paris.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Did you, as well as sort of this sense of maybe something bubbling up within French society, was there any sense that culturally there things were changing that perhaps could explain what was coming?
Thank you for the question. I wish I'd had more time to reflect on it. I think things were certainly changing. It was increasing impatience with the rigidity of the Gaullist government. I had, when I first went to France, I had an introduction to what had been a fairly preeminent family. And my particular friends were a generation older than I was. And so I used to chat with them about this, and they thought, yes, the general thought among their friends was that de Gaulle had done a great service to France, both during the war and in the establishment of the Fifth French Republic, but that this had been going on for 9-10 years, and he was increasingly rigid, and so were many of the men surrounding him. So I was, in a way, the question might be, was I surprised by what happened as opposed to, did I expect it to happen? I was not at all surprised. There was no surprise there, because also I lived at the Cité Universitaire with a lot of students from other places, but my particular residence in the year in question was the Maison du Brésil, which I'd gone to because it provided a single room for doctoral woman students. I couldn't get that at the Maison du Canada. But my immediate neighbor was a French girl from Grenoble, and I saw a lot of what evolved through her eyes. So she was preparing for l'agrégation and in mathematics, and she felt that things were changing, and she communicated that thought to me. I had other friends from other countries who were more intimately involved in the affairs at the Sorbonne, and they kept talking about things that were changing there. So nothing was a surprise, but I wouldn't say that I was aware of step-by-step changes leading to the event.
And had you managed to get involved in anything in terms of activism, socially, politically?
Not much, because there wasn't a whole lot going on aside from being able to attend that commemoration I mentioned in '67 until the last year, '68, and by then I was desperately trying to have as many hours in archives and libraries as I could. So I was very much an observer. I had a few friends who participated in some of the events. One of my friends got tear gassed. That put me off. I did see the CRS on street corners after major events. Maybe I should mention now the dates when I was there.
Okay, so the next question is going to be, to talk us through how you started to experience.
Okay. Well, I had personal reasons for going to Chicago at the end of April, and I think I don't have the exact dates, but I've worked them out as being away from France and in the States in Chicago, 25 April to 8th May. And then because of the general strike and because we couldn't work, I did decide to go to England and visit my family at the very end of May. I believe I left Paris on the 31st and then returned to Paris, 31st of May, returned to Paris on the 10th of June because we thought we could get back into the archives. So I was there for 21 days of May, from I think the 9th to the 31st.
And were the archives closed?
They weren't necessarily closed, but documentation wasn't necessarily available. So being served was haphazard, and I went a few times when they were actually closed, and then I moved on to other places. I was at the Archives de la Seine by that time, as well as the Archives Nationales. They're not too far apart, and I go back and forth between the two as long as I could get documentation. But by the end of May, the general strike had taken effect. I don't know whether everybody was striking at once, but most services were closed down, and we couldn't actually get documentation anywhere, really, and not reliably.
And how would you,
in the afternoon, it wasn't available the following morning, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And how would you summarize your day-to-day experiences during this growing set of events?
Right. Well, I was out of France for Nanterre, and that was in a way helpful because some of my friends and family were following things better than I could, both then and later. So I guess my first experience was that even when I was there, I didn't necessarily know what was going on. So by the time I went back on I think the 8th, some of my family were making me aware that they didn't know what I was going back to. And I certainly didn't know when I got off the plane either. But then I think that was the night when there were some significant encounters among the students, now between the students and the police, I guess. And the CRS had perhaps come in by then as well. And a lot of the posters. Well, again, I wish you could tell me instead of my telling you, but as soon as posters were before me, I was impressed by them. I was sometimes amused by them and sometimes very moved by them. And I could certainly see the student point of view. But it seemed to me that when the encounters between students and workers at the Renault factory occurred, and there seemed to be an understanding, that was a golden moment, but it was also an important moment in the evolution of events. But then, it's almost 50 years ago. Then the next thing, two things that come to mind are the general strike and the inconvenience, the social inconvenience as well, not only without buses, and I think the metro wasn't working, but also garbage collection, and quite a lot of shop owners, I think, had either closed up or gone away, which have the same result. So the life of the city wasn't so interesting, nor did I expect it to be, but I thought I should have another plan. So I did consider going to England, and the postal services must still have been working. I couldn't afford to phone, and although my relatives in England didn't know when I was coming, they weren't surprised that I did. But otherwise, the Maison du Brésil was having its own events. Now, Brazil was a dictatorship at the time, and the direction of the Maison du Brésil was by a government appointee, I think, regarded by Brazilians as something of a fascist. But and I suppose some of the membership in the Maison du Brésil were also there because of government approval, but some were certainly much more activist. So among the students, there was an obvious tension. And soon after my return from the United States, I took part in a discussion of a constitution for the Maison du Brésil, and became aware of Brazilian politics. And that became increasingly important in my personal life, because it was partly that life in the Maison du Brésil was no longer what it had been, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen next. Occasionally, Brazilian men whom I barely knew would tell me I would be safe no matter what happened, which suggested that other people might not be safe. And I heard a rumor, but I never confirmed it, that there was a murder, a settling of old political scores, Brazilian politics questions in the house. What did happen just before I went to England was that the house was taken over by Marxists, and by the time I got back, it was taken over by anarchists. So seeing red flags and black flags run up over the house was kind of interesting. It's a Le Corbusier structure, so that made it all the more interesting that these things were happening there. And on a very, very personal level, when I prepared to go to Chicago, I wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen. But even at that time, I thought, well, maybe I'll put some of my thesis notes away in a trunk that was stored in the basement. And then when I went to England, I put all my thesis notes there, very much influenced by the fact that at the Maison du Canada, we had a myth, and it's substantiated, about a historian who, when the Nazis were arriving in Paris in 1940, had carefully stowed his notes and in fact come back later and not found them. So I thought, well, I'd better do something with my thesis notes. And so I stored them in my metal trunk and I locked it up. And at that point, we wrote on it, property of a Canadian student. And I actually wrote that in both red and black. And I've never known if that made a difference, because on my return from England, we could start work again, and I needed the notes. So I went to the then direction, which I think was anarchist. Well, previously, I think that the communists had said that the trunk room was locked up and I couldn't get into it. So I had a young man whom I knew climb into it. It was kind of a cage arrangement. He stowed the last of the notes. So when I got back, I said, well, can I get into the trunk room to get my notes? And very pleasant, presumably anarchist on the desk, said, no, because the previous administration took the keys. We don't know how to get into it, but we're going to blow it up one of these days, so we'll let you know where. I said, what do you mean by blow it up? And he said, well, we'll just blow the lock. For you, we'll blow the lock. I said, well, I didn't like to say otherwise we'll climb into it. But eventually I got around to, and again with the same friend, went down and looked at the state of the trunk room before we could even get my notes out of it. I noticed that a lot of things had been blown up, including a number of trunks near my own, but it was sitting in splendid isolation, and I didn't lose a single note.
Oh, good.
So that was the personal. But the other thing was, my most direct experience of the general strike, I think, was when we were taking the bus, well, when we were arranging to go to England. Of course, you could say, well, how would one get to England? It didn't look like being an easy thing. Rich people were taking taxis to the frontier. We heard a lot about that. But then I heard that de Gaulle, again, rumor, probably, doubt if it had any substance, but that de Gaulle particularly wanted English people to be able to get out, so had authorized a modification of the Skyways arrangements, whereby one went by bus to Beauvais, then by English plane across the channel to Lyme, and then took a train, I think, or maybe a bus to Victoria. But anyway, that wasn't working. However, a kind of modification of the system was working. So I had to get to the Place de la République, take the bus from there, and go not to the regular airport at Beauvais, but to a military airport. And all this was kind of, hush-hush and great care for national security taken. We weren't allowed to linger anywhere once we were in a military installation. That was the most interesting trip, but it started leaving the Maison du Brésil with a suitcase, which was far too big. But I couldn't handle myself. Another very kind man friend decided he would accompany me to the Place de la République. He was staying. And then I met the other friend there. But on the journey, we had heard buses were running that day, but they weren't. Again, it's the 31st of May. And neither were taxis. There was just no transportation. But I think because of the suitcase, somebody in a tiny Renault picked us up and the suitcase, and there really wasn't room for anything else in the car except the three of us. And this turned out to be a public health nurse who was doing volunteer shifts at hospitals because some of the staff had left. And she was also delivering medicine to shut-ins who couldn't otherwise get it. So she was flat out. She said she'd had very little sleep for weeks, and or over a week, 10 days, I think. And so naturally, when she offered to drive us, she also excused herself and said, I may not be able to take you exactly where you're going, but I'll take you close. And she did, and we were able to walk from there. But that was my direct insight into one Parisian's experience of being involved, not necessarily in political or social action, but in public service. Or I guess that's a form of,
yeah. I wondered if you'd had any experience of the university occupations or the Sorbonne during the events.
No, I only knew people who had. Again, the girl from Grenoble who was trying to get the agrégation. Her experience was trying to attend her exam, and that didn't take place because it was blocked. And of course, that was one of several personal discomfitures and tragedies I witnessed, because she never did complete the agrégation. And my friend who helped with the suitcase was a musician, and he was hoping to finish his studies at the conservatory that year, but exams were not held then, so he missed out as well. They got the training they got, but they didn't get the certification that they'd hoped to leave with. Otherwise, yes, I had a friend who had said he'd hurled a few paving stones at the police near the Sorbonne, but I didn't see that happen.
Okay, you mentioned earlier the coming together of students and workers, and you described it as a golden moment. Can you elaborate on that?
That was one of the things I read about in Le Monde. I couldn't always get any newspaper, but when I could get Le Monde, I did, and I felt that educated me a little bit about what was going on. But I also depended on my English and Canadian relatives to write to me, because for some reason the Postal Service seemed to me to work quite a bit. I guess sometimes the mail accumulated, and then I read it with interest. But whatever Le Monde said is what I knew then about it. Just that there perhaps had not previously been an understanding between these seemingly two separate social classes. And there were statements about, now I do understand.
Okay, another characteristic that's often associated with 68 is this idea of la prise de parole, and suddenly everybody was talking to each other. And
yes. Did
you have any experience of that? Would you be able to talk to that?
No, I was also surrounded by historians who were somewhat skeptical about whether we knew what was going on and whether this was real. I remember one incident, though, involving an elderly couple who lived in the Latin Quarter, who unfortunately experienced, they were harmed by tear gas. And I don't know how old they were, but I think I understood in their 80s. They had tried to protect students. They hadn't previously had a lot to do with students. They didn't have students living with them, but I think their experience was made known on the radio. I didn't have one, but a friend told me about this in some detail, and because it had been reported that way, and that seemed like the sort of thing that could happen. We talked about it, and the students who knew students who'd been there would say things like, yes, a lot of support from local residents for the students, at least in the early days, in that mid-May period. I think everybody got tired of the restrictions and also of the presence of the CIs.
talking of the CRS, do you consider the events of 1968 to have been a violent moment?
We have so much violence in the world now, and there's been so much between 1968 and now. It looks not particularly violent. I have to say, again, I think of myself as somebody on the left, but I was astounded at the state's restraint. I know people got hurt, and I know students who should not have been hit were hit, and I disapprove of that. But since then, we've seen governments react in much more violent ways. Tiananmen Square came in 1989. By contrast, I think that the Gaullist government was restrained. And I dare say Pompidou had something to do with that, but I'm not well informed.
One of the questions I wanted to ask was, how would you assess the reaction of the political elite at the time?
Well, only a personal comment. I mentioned the French family, whom I'm so very fond of. And you'd call them upper middle class, liberal Catholics then and later, very sympathetic towards students, a large family. All of the family were highly educated at universities and at the special schools and so on. And the head of the family in the early stages said to me, well, this is not revolution because these young people care too much about their appearance. If you're going to go and make revolution, you don't get dressed up carefully first. And they're middle-class children, and they won't last very long. And later, and I think that was the assessment of the members of the government as well. So later, my particular friends said they were impressed. They conceded to me a little bit. They said I'd taken the early events much more seriously than they had. And they had thought things would settle down sooner. No, I think maybe I've lost the thread. Were you more concerned about perception or reality?
No, I wondered if you can recall how you felt about the reaction of Mitterrand, of Mendes France, of Pompidou, of de Gaulle, of that, the general political.
Right. Well, on the subject of de Gaulle, I was always interested in de Gaulle, and I only ever saw him once, and I think that was on the day of Maréchal Juin's funeral. But no, I heard the two speeches, one on the 24th and the other on the 30th. And I certainly thought the one on the 24th was that of an old man who was losing his grip. And then we heard about all those movements, going and checking up with the army and disappearing for a few hours and so on. So it did look as though someone else might take over. First he promised a referendum, and then he came back with the promise of elections. Now, this speech about elections, I didn't hear until the following day. I believe it was rebroadcast on the morning of the 31st. And that was the day I was leaving Paris by bus, finally, and retracing going back over some of the roads, residential parts of Paris that I'd been through before, earlier that day. And I think the speech was being rebroadcast then because we could hear it through people's windows, heard parts of it. And someone had a copy of it on the bus, and so we read it. That sounded a little stronger, but still, I thought I felt at the time this is an old man who may well be losing his grip, and I was both wrong and right because of course he won the election, but he lost the longer term. He was gone very soon after that.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
No, that's okay. I wondered if you recall having a sense of what was happening beyond Paris and more in the regions.
Right. Not really. Any impressions I have come later. There's a film, I think, called, I forget the French name, but it's called, in English, it's called May Fools.
Milou en mai.
Pardon?
It's Milou en mai.
Milkman, okay, yeah, okay. Well, you know what I mean. I haven't seen it, but I think it probably captures some of the tension. But I did very much see the film Français si vous saviez, and I liked seeing that because it seemed to me that it expressed some of the feelings I had in '68 with regard to de Gaulle and his significance in the history of the country, but his heavy hand as well, or the heavy hand of the Gaullists. But I don't know who decided that they wouldn't send in the army and they wouldn't send in heavy equipment. But whoever did was wise, I think.
Very. Do you recall thinking that what was happening in France in 1968 as part of something that was happening internationally? Yeah.
I was back in Canada on the West Coast for Czechoslovakia. And at that point, I thought, yes, there may well be a connection. Not only that, but when I was in Chicago, I'd attended a anti-war demonstration. And then there was Czechoslovakia. Then I went to Purdue University for my 2 years teaching there, taught war veterans, and also witnessed anti-ROTC demonstrations against recruitment on university campuses. I had students who'd been at the Chicago Democratic Convention at the end of the summer of '68. It did certainly seem to be possible links, but I didn't think necessarily. I thought they were perhaps coincidental. What I hoped was that they were the beginning of an era of more liberal, open government and politics and such. And on the question of France, it seems to me that the French did at least get their reform of universities and an improvement in I think the system was liberalized, and I think there was greater opportunity for talent to rise, perhaps as a result of '68.
Can you recall how you felt when the events were finally brought to a conclusion in June '68 when de Gaulle wins the election?
Yes, I guess that was the end. It wasn't necessarily the end for the Maison du Brésil. And no, I had to leave in July. I guess a certain relief that we could get back to work, a certain puzzlement still about what I had or had not witnessed or been on the edge of. It was a while. I guess within a year or two, books became available, particularly in French, talking about May '68. And I read those with interest, but I didn't feel I was any more enlightened than I had been at the time.
Yeah.
But I think at the time I observed with more care and knew more than I do now. I just it hasn't been uppermost in my mind, and I didn't perhaps do as much thinking about this before talking to you because I really didn't know where to start.
It's fine. It's absolutely fine. It's perfect.
No. But somewhere in your doc or in your questions, you ask about whether I wrote letters and whether people wrote letters to me.
That was my next question.
I got that documentation. I'm not here in Fredericton at the moment.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, that's one of the questions I was going to ask was, can you recall how your friends and family felt back home, and were they worried? Did they know? What did you say to each other?
Right. I don't suppose anybody was very worried because we trusted the French and we trusted the French government, and I'd been having a very satisfactory time till then. And but my great uncle in England said he'd been glued to the television screen. I have a feeling he was hoping to see me as opposed to worried that he might see me in a student demonstration or some such thing. I don't think he can have been serious because that he must have known I probably wouldn't do that. But no, I wouldn't say they were worried, and I wouldn't say we were all that keen for it to be over, but I was very keen to finish my research. One of the things that always puzzled me about it was in a way, I suppose the Paris demonstrations student movement was international, but I think it had not some non-French leadership, did it not? Who was Cohn-Bendit was a German student, but was he a student in Paris?
Yes, he had dual nationality. He was
right.
German and French. He chose German nationality so he could avoid doing French military service. So,
right, yeah.
so yeah, but he was a bit of a. But there is an international influence, and obviously, with hindsight, we can see why that was the case with everything that was going on and so forth. So,
right.
It's not that much. Can I ask you, how did you perceive the impact on France at that time, and subsequently, more long term? How do you think 1968 has changed France, or what consequences have there been?
Well, I wondered if it could be fit into the revolutionary tradition. I think that was the question. So the significance of 1968 came up again in 1989 when at my own university we were organizing celebrations of the bicentennial of the French Revolution. And I couldn't see very many direct connections. I was more inclined personally to think that the event I'd witnessed in 67, the commemoration of the Commune, was the end of a link with that revolutionary tradition. And I don't know. We said in 89 that the celebrations were related to the fact that the revolution was finally over. So whether 68 could be seen as the last moment in the French Revolution that was now finally over, in the sense that it was finally accepted. So I guess by extrapolation, I could say, well, if the revolution is finally accepted in 89, perhaps the fact that middle-class young people were involved in 68 helped that generation to be willing to accept the results. I don't think France is a particularly liberal society at the moment. I tremble for my French as well as my American friends these days, because we could be so worried about the future. But I think there was a time in the 60s and the 70s when things opened up quite a lot. There was greater opportunity for young French people. But I suppose it was careers open to talents as opposed to recognizing the rights of workers. But in a way, the workers' rights had been recognized and were further recognized in 68. I think the agreements that came out of 68 with regard not only to universities, but also with regard to workers, were essentially good. I think that no government then or later could foresee the needs of the future. Although I had a slight foretaste of that, I guess, at the Cité Universitaire, where there were so many North African and Arab students, and African students too, for that matter. You know, if massive immigration and then eventual, of course, the whole problem of dealing with or accommodating refugees, the whole question of accommodating refugees, that was very much in the future. But I could certainly understand in the 60s that so many people, particularly those who'd been educated in France, saw France as their natural home and a place they might like to live, and that this could cause massive immigration, particularly if conditions elsewhere became less pleasant. I guess it's always assumed that students will go home, but they don't necessarily, and if things are not good at home, they may migrate back to where they have been. Yeah. That's not really an answer to the question, but the problems of then seem to me to have been addressed, and some of them seem to have been solved. Whether a foundation for a happy future was built is less certain.
So would you say your overall assessment of the consequences of 1968 would be positive?
Well, I think so, because of the university reform that French friends thought was good. Perhaps, I'm sure it could have gone further. And I believe the end, as far as workers were concerned, I believe a lot of contracts were renegotiated, opened up and renegotiated. I'm not sure that state reform went as far as it should have done. So I'm sure there was disappointment. But we also know that such events are often followed by repression, and I think the French avoided that. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was important.
Okay. Do you think that your experience of these events had an impact on how you understand France?
How I understand the French?
And France, more generally.
And France. Oh, yes. Some things were reinforced. My experience in France was of a highly evolved democracy that was also very bureaucratized. I guess some of the bureaucratic hassles were a little bit reduced as a result of '68, but not all that much. However, I thought a certain amount of flexibility was among French people, Parisians, was in evidence. I was much more impressed by people's reactions to 1968 and then to the way they lived afterwards. I mean, I visited France quite a lot in the '70s and halfway through the '80s. I was there often. It seemed to me that if that period was referred to, it was more or less in my circles positively, and that the results seemed to be fairly positive.
Do you think your experience of these events had an impact on you personally or politically?
No, I think not really. But I was glad I was there. I wouldn't say I was energized, but I was impressed by the enthusiasm that I witnessed among. They were slightly younger students, and they were French students mostly. They were local. They were people who were going to continue to live in France. And no, the optimism, youthful optimism, that stayed with me. The memory of that, and I guess it encouraged me to want to be a university professor and want to encourage young people to follow idealistic pursuits. I haven't said anything about the idealism, but I think there is a certain amount of idealism, not necessarily always informed or worked out rationally, but I think that's good for societies as well. I wouldn't want young people to get old too soon.
And do you think that your experience of '68 had any influence on your research on France, on your scholarship?
No, I'd already taken, by anyone's lights, if you heard me say I was on the left and committed to social reform and so on, but in the end, I've spent most of my life studying the suppression and exile and dispersal of the French Jesuits of the 18th century. The way in which the French state seized their property and dispersed the men. I see that as an aspect of the history of the French church, but particularly of French education. So I suppose if there were any kind of link, it's through my respect for the curriculum taught in Jesuit colleges and my hope that liberal education would be maintained, at least in our Western universities, for as long as possible. And I thought that it was education in history and Sciences Po and such liberal arts had encouraged these students, the students, to think that they could maybe make a significant change and get what they wanted in the way of education for themselves. I saw that as a justification for the liberal arts. So I guess I'd been studying men who taught the liberal arts, and now I saw a justification for them. So that kind of vague link.
Okay. Just a couple more questions. Have you kept an interest on how the story of 1968 has been told in France?
No, I wish I had. I wish I knew. I wish I could find out easily. I guess if I were to come across a book review or a book, I'm sure I would read it. Sorry not to have read yours.
Don't worry.
I might now look for it. No. Yes, I'm interested, but I wouldn't go out of my way, I suppose, to do a lot of digging. Maybe the 50-year commemoration will bring things to my attention that will be of interest. I'll enjoy that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way in which the story has been told over the last 40, now almost 50 years, is that you know, at each of these commemorations, the story takes another turn, or the sort of dominant narrative is constructed. And, you know, my analysis or criticism of that is that it's quite a narrow focus on students, on Paris, and on May '68, and you know, I've asked people if they thought that the way the story is told fully captures their experience of it. But if you haven't been keeping an eye on it, then
that's right. And also, it just so happened I wasn't in the provinces in that period, and was narrowly focused myself. But I was aware that the whole of France was involved in some sense.
Yeah. Okay, so one last question, possibly the hardest question. So I've asked everybody to, if they were asked to summarize the events of 1968 in 30 seconds, or their experience of it, how would they do it?
Okay. A challenging moment for a city, the expression of a dream, the partial realization of hopes, and in a way, a challenge for the next generation.